Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to Fuel Your Wellness. My name is Ashley Grant. I'm a registered dietitian and wellness enthusiast. I help individuals ditch diet culture, adopt food freedom, adopt plant-based lifestyles, ditch some medications, and so much more. I'm extremely passionate about helping individuals to find that food freedom, and we can talk a little bit more today about what that means. And essentially what that is eating without limits, without disordered eating patterns. In the last episode, I mentioned 7 different ways in which disordered eating might be happening in your life without maybe you even noticing it. And so today, I want to give you 7 different ways in which you can combat disordered eating. So without further ado, let's get right into it. And the first way is to balance your meals. Now, this might sound pretty basic and pretty simple, and it can be, but also if you don't know what balanced meals are, then it can be complicated and you might not know how to go about this. So let's break down what a balanced meal is. Every meal that you have, in order to be considered a complete meal, has to have 3 different parts. And so the first part, let's go over that. That will have either a fruit or a vegetable. And I always say one or the other, but having both is awesome too. But a non-starchy vegetable in particular. So that would be something like spinach, broccoli, cauliflower, eggplant, bell peppers, onions, mushrooms, and so many other things. And of course, fruits, you can pick your favorite fruit, add it into your meal, and fresh or frozen are definitely best, but there's also dried fruit and canned options as well for fruits and vegetables, if that's the option that is gonna get you to eat those vegetables and fruits. So that's the first part of that balanced meal. Now, the second part is the non-starchy the starchy vegetable, I should say, and maybe it's a whole grain, so some type of starch in general. And that might look like corn, it might look like plantains, it might look like brown rice, it might look like whole wheat pasta, or it could be like squash, some type of winter squash, maybe butternut squash is the one that you're familiar with, or acorn squash, or potatoes, or sweet potatoes. So we do want a starch on your plate at every meal. And I often recommend, especially for anyone who is trying to manage diabetes, to go more for the whole grains more often than the starchy vegetables. But both of these things, so the fruit and vegetable and the starch of some sort, we want on your plate. And then the third part, which most people are very familiar with and they understand that this needs to be part of every meal, is a protein source. Now, I'm going to give you some options for more Mediterranean style and then options for plant-based. So more Mediterranean style protein sources might look like salmon, it might look like chicken breast, it might look like turkey or other fish. And for the plant-based style, it might more so look like chickpeas, cannellini beans, tofu, tempeh, lentils. And so those are more so the plant-based options. And you can do a mix of both if you want, but often I have a lot of clients who are looking to add more plants. So if you want to opt for more plant-based options, go for those legumes and the tofu and tempeh. Edamame is a great choice as well. So what this balanced meal as a whole might look like, I'll give you a few examples. And I'll give you a breakfast example to start. That might look like oatmeal, that's your whole grain, with some berries, that's your fruit, and then maybe some peanut butter for your protein source, maybe some seeds as well. And that's a simple, easy, balanced meal you could start the day with. Lunch might more so look like, let's say it's a soup. You could have some beans in your soup, some vegetables like kale and bell peppers and zucchini, and then you might also have a whole grain like whole grain pasta in there. So that's a nice balanced meal as well. And then maybe for dinner you have some salmon, some brown rice, and some broccoli. So those are all 3 examples of balanced meals. Some are plant-based and some are not. but those are some that you might want to incorporate, and maybe assess if you're considering every meal for balancing your meals, because a lot of times I see people are just trying to balance their dinners, and people do great with dinners. They're eating really healthy and well-balanced meals, but sometimes we forget the breakfast and lunch also needs to be balanced, and sometimes even snacks. So again, number one, eat those balanced meals. It's gonna make you feel so much more nourished, and it's gonna get you all those nutrients you need instead of kind of lacking certain vitamins and minerals, which can cause a deficiency. Now, number two is establish consistency. Now, as you may or may not know, our bodies thrive on consistency and on routine. And so it makes us feel safe. If we're eating maybe every 8 hours or 7 hours, that's gonna make our bodies go into fight or flight mode, right? That's feeling super unsafe, that's in that stress response, and we don't wanna be there if we can help it, right? So if we can establish some consistency within a routine, that's gonna be the best way to go. And for everyone, it's gonna look different. For some people, consistency might look like the same time every day because maybe that's the way their schedule works for work. And for some other people, it might just be, okay, I'm gonna eat every few hours when I get the opportunity to. So maybe setting alarms, that's often what I have people do in the start of that routine in order to establish a habit, kind of setting alarms to remind yourself until you get in the habit without needing the alarm. So that's gonna be a great thing to help you prevent binges even, because if you're eating so far apart, let's say your breakfast is at 7 a.m. and then you don't eat lunch and then you don't eat till like 5 p.m., your body is gonna go into kind of like starvation mode. It thinks it's in starvation mode and it thinks it needs to eat as much as it can, as quick as it can, and that will end up leading to perhaps a binge or overeating or a lot of excessive snacking at night. And I think a lot of people do experience this. So if you are, maybe that's one of the reasons. Maybe you want to assess your consistency in your daytime with eating habits. And number three is paying attention to hunger cues. So this might look like, on a scale of 1 to 10, noticing, am I like at the closer to the 0 end or am I closer to the 10 end? 10 being I'm overly stuffed, kind of like how we feel after Thanksgiving dinner, or 0 being that hangry state, right? And if we can pay attention to where we are with our hunger cues, maybe paying attention to how our body reacts when we're hungry, that's gonna really help. And something I wanna point out with hunger cues is that a lot of us tend to notice what really excessive, super hungry looks like or feels like in our bodies and what super stuffed feels like, but we don't know what that middle area even feels like because we don't pay attention enough. So that's why I say to start paying attention more often, and that again might mean setting an alarm in the middle of the day randomly to check in with yourself and see, where am I on that scale? Am I closer to a 10? Am I closer to the middle area? Should I eat a snack right now? Should I eat a meal? What does that look like for me? And that's gonna really help you to listen when your body whispers so you don't have to hear it scream. So you don't wanna hear it screaming to one extent or the other. We wanna kind of have it in that like 4 to 6 range instead of the 0 or the 10. And that's even gonna help with consistency as well, because when you're consistent, it kind of goes hand in hand. When you're consistent, you probably won't get to the end of the 0 or the end of the 10. You probably will be able to stay a little bit more level in that middle range. And that will help a lot with feeling better, feeling more energy throughout the day, and not feeling like you are gonna binge at the end of the day or overeat or just feel like you want a bunch of different snacks at the end of the day that you could get earlier on in the day. So those two definitely go hand in hand. So that was number 3, paying attention to those hunger cues. And number 4 is really important to me in the way I practice, which is to ditch counting calories and to go for a more intuitive approach. And this is kind of also tagging right along with those hunger cues, because in order to be intuitive with eating, you have to listen to your body, right? And it's interesting because sometimes we let our minds trick us into thinking we're hungry when really we're hungry for something else, like emotional hunger, connection with others, maybe, lacking stimulation is something we need. But we want to know the difference between physical hunger and emotional hunger. And that comes with intuition and like noticing how your body is feeling. But also not using calorie counting is so important to find that intuition, because if we focus on an exact number every day, that's not listening to what your body actually needs, right? Because some days we might need a lot more calories than other days, a lot more certain nutrients than other days, a lot more fluid than other days, more rest than other days, more exercise than other days. So if we are just paying attention to a certain number or a certain goal we're trying to meet without listening to how our body is actually responding to what we're doing, then we're gonna end up going into more of like a fad diet, which is not sustainable, as we all know, right? So that's something, I think if we can really identify when we're hungry, we can start to eat then, instead of, just eating to eat, or because of a time of day, or because you want to reach a certain amount of calories or not go over a certain amount of calories. And same goes with exercise. I know I've discussed this in the past with exercising, and even being more intuitive with exercise, going until you feel good, instead of going to a certain extent of burning a certain amount of calories. It's really important to start to pay attention to that. And if you start living intuitively in other areas of life, it's going to be easier to eat intuitively. Eating is probably one of the most challenging behaviors, because it's so near and dear to our hearts, and we have so much attached to it. A lot of emotional attachment comes along with food, especially, holidays are rolling around with Thanksgiving, and we do tend to have a lot of attachment. And it makes sense, because we have attachment with family members, right? Maybe your grandma makes the best green bean casserole or mashed potatoes or whatever it is for your family. Think about that and think of why it's so special to you and so important. Food is tied to culture and tradition and experiences, and so it makes sense why we are so attached to it. So if we can start living intuitively in other ways first, it might help us a lot. So that might even look as simple as, when we're tired, go to bed, instead of pushing ourselves to stay up later, right? Same thing with exercise, like I said. If we are feeling burnt out, even though we might not have reached our calorie burning goal, let's stop there, right? Not pushing ourselves past the point of, getting into a maybe outside of our comfort zone. Maybe sometimes we need to be in that comfort zone, and that's okay. So those intuitive ways of living, I'll say, are probably the first place to start, and then we can go into the food. If you feel like you've mastered those things, maybe you can start diving into how you can eat intuitively. And that would be like checking in with those hunger cues. That's a great start. And also throwing away the apps that count calories, and really finding, what am I hungry for? And that leads us kind of into the next point, which is number 5, let your feelings guide you. And what I mean by this is if you feel good by eating a certain food, we want more of that. And if we feel not so good after eating a certain food, we want to reduce that intake in our eating habits, or maybe eliminate it depending on the severity. So, diet culture it can be tricky, because often we consider low calorie foods as good and high calorie foods as bad. But that's not necessarily what we want to consider good and bad. We want to take a more individualized approach and notice, this certain food makes me feel bloated, or gives me a headache, or just makes me feel really bad in my skin. And we want to have less of those things, and then more of the things that make us feel nourished and energized. And like, we want to have even things that might be more so considered from diet culture to be good, but we want to define them as good for our own selves without noticing if it's good or not for diet culture. And that's really like using intuition and noticing how your body feels. And if you're not paying attention to that, you want to be sensitive to that, so that way you can notice maybe even sensitivities with, a lot of people have a gluten sensitivity, for example, or dairy. Like, those are pretty popular. So noticing, like, is that something that you've noticed bothers you when you eat, or is it something completely different? One of my favorite foods, unfortunately, is one thing that I'm sensitive to: dates. And so even though it's good and healthy, according to diet culture, it's also not something that makes me feel good. So that's something I need to have less of. And I've recognized that, even though it tastes so good and it's great in terms of the nutrient levels and how healthy it is. So that's just something I encourage you to start, maybe even writing a list of: these foods make me feel energized and good, and these foods make me feel lethargic and depressed. And you would be you'd be surprised as to how much our gut health relates to our mental health. And you can really discern the difference between those two categories. I think if you can do that, you will really thrive in what you eat, instead of listening to, oh, the internet says this eggs are bad for you, or this is bad for you. Find it in yourself to know what's good and bad for you as an individual, because I could have, a bunch of different people come to me and ask what's good, and I'm going to have a bunch of different answers, because every single person is so different with their genetic makeup, with their preferences, and so much more. And so, also within that diet culture extreme of good and bad, we also have to recognize if something's, good for us and we don't enjoy it, and even after trying it a bunch of different ways, it's not sustainable to be eating that food for us, because we're going to eventually hate it, right? And that's not something we want to do. We want to enjoy the process of eating so that it's not a hassle and it's not a task. So going right into number 6 is identifying non-negotiables and being realistic with that. It's like the number one thing I do in the first session with clients. I'm like, all right, what are your non-negotiables? For me, I always explain it's chocolate. No one's going to tell me I'm not going to eat chocolate. So for some people it's coffee, and there's so many different ones for different people, because different people have different preferences. But you want to be realistic around that. So what I mean by this is, diets exclude your non-negotiables. So I don't want anyone to be dieting, right? So if you're watching this and you're thinking, oh, I want to get healthier for this reason or this reason, I must have to cut out ice cream, because even though it's my favorite. I don't want you to do that, because if you do that, it's not going to be sustainable, and you're going to white knuckle it for however long you can. And then once you're not able to tolerate that restriction anymore, you're going to probably overdo it and get like a gallon of ice cream and go eat it, right? So instead of that binge restrict cycle, think, okay, this is my favorite food, my favorite dessert, my favorite treat. How can I instead incorporate this into a pattern that works for me without overdoing it? And so that's something that you'll have to kind of really put together on your own, and maybe with help from someone like a dietitian, in order to find, like, how am I going to be able to incorporate my ice cream and still be healthier, or my other non-negotiable and still be healthy, and maybe reduce medications, or maybe lose weight if that's what you're trying to do for your health. Those things are really important. And if you can't do a certain habit lifelong, then it's not something that you should do at all, ever. Right? If you're saying, oh, I need to get rid of ice cream, if you can't get rid of ice cream forever, then it's not something you should ever do at all. So I think it's important to notice that what you like for a reason. Your body likes for a reason. Your mind likes for a reason. And so you should honor those cravings and make sure that you're just doing it in a healthier way. Which leads us right into number 7, which is finding your gray area. I think this is so important, but the hardest one. It is so hard, and the reason it's hard is because diet culture has made us think in black and white, from one extreme to the other, instead of finding the gray area. So we are such extremists, really, here in America at least. We're very extremists when it comes to food. It's like either I'm eating just salads and lettuce and cucumbers and smoothies, or I'm eating fries and pizza and burgers. It's like, what about that middle area? What about that gray area? And that's where that last point I was mentioning comes into play here, is combining some of the healthier, more nutrient-dense foods like fruits and vegetables with those more non-negotiables that you chose, or, you know, the things that are more treats for you. So that might look like, and I have a little example here that I can kind of explain to you what that could look like in your own habits. So breakfast might look like, you know, oatmeal. It could be pretty healthy with banana, but then maybe some peanut butter and dark chocolate, right, to add to it so that you can find that balance in the daytime. Maybe snacks, you have crackers and hummus and cucumbers, like a little bit of the salty crunchy. Maybe you have a salad with a bunch of vegetables, your favorite dressing, and maybe a side of chips with it, right, so that you can have a little bit of that balance. And, you know, snack could be yogurt with some pureed fruit and maybe some brownie or cookie with it. And then dinner might be, you know, a black bean burger and vegetables, and it could have like fries on the side. So really finding that balance in your day is going to help you so much. I promise it really will, because we often find that, oh my gosh, if I let myself have my favorite food, I'm gonna overdo it. And we get into that fear mentality. But something I actually saw recently that I've been really loving, this quote, is you can either trust or you can control, but you can't do both, right? So you can either trust that I'm not gonna crave this all the time, or you can control, and then that control is going to end up leading to the whole binge restrict cycle. And that's really unhealthy. So if you can kind of mix into your day, your routine, your favorite foods that might be more treats with more nourishing foods, it's going to be such a healthy balance mentally and physically for you. And you'll be able to incorporate just the right amount of nutrients with just the right amount of like maybe sweet or salty types of snacks that you enjoy, and you won't have to feel like you're white knuckling anymore. And that's what food freedom is kind of that last point that I shared, is that gray area. That's what food freedom looks like. It looks like eating what you want when you want it, and trusting that you're not gonna always want brownies. The only reason you want brownies right now all the time is because you say you can't have them. You're telling yourself you can't. So of course you're gonna want them, just like a child. We all have inner children within us, right? And so that's that inner child saying, well, you said I can't have it, so I want it more. So allow yourself, if you start to allow that and give yourself space in that gray area, you will be able to thrive with your favorite foods and find an eating pattern that's good for you. Doesn't matter what the internet says is right or wrong, you can choose intuitively what works best for you. So I want to go through and review those different points to really allow for you to grasp all the different concepts we talked about today. So the first one was balancing your meals with a fruit or a non-starchy vegetable, or both, a starch or a whole grain, and a protein. The second point was to establish consistency in your eating routine. The third point was to pay attention to those hunger cues. The fourth point was ditch the calorie counting and practice intuitive eating. 5 is let your feelings guide you. 6 is identify non-negotiables and being realistic with that. And number 7 is to find that gray area. So if you can really go through these different points, maybe you wrote them down, maybe you found, oh my gosh, I really relate to this one point. Start with whatever point you relate to the most and start to go really dive into that deeply until you master that, and then move on to another one. And keep doing that until you hit all 7 points and you feel like, wow, I am thriving and I feel good and I feel like I'll never have to diet again, which is my goal for everyone. And if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them. You can email any questions to me that you have, or any topics you want to hear about in an upcoming episode. I really hope you take with you all these different tips and really thrive and live your best life. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Ashley, and I will see you next time. so as many of us know, we can really get into that hangry state when we're not eating as frequently as we should be. And we can also get from that hangry state, we can overeat to the point that we eat too much and feel overly stuffed. And one way we can really work on correcting this behavior is by using a hunger fullness scale. So what that is a scale of 1 through 10. And it can help you identify where you are on the scale, and we really want to make sure we're staying within the safe zone, which is really in the middle part of this scale. And what this can do is help you to not overeat, and it can help you choose better options as well. And when we get to that hangry state, we tend to do a few things. And one of those things is the speed in which we're eating is a lot quicker. So we can eat more quickly, which also ends up leading us into eating too much. And not to mention the types of food we go for when we're hangry versus when we're just slightly hungry are going to be probably more high-fat, high-salty foods or high-fat, high-sugar foods. And that might look like, the example I like to give is, say you're super, super hungry in that hangry state of mind, and you have a donut in front of you and an apple in front of you. You are more likely to choose the donut because it's quicker fuel, it's gonna get into your bloodstream quicker, it's higher in fat, higher in calories, and that's what your body needs for that really like kind of starvation mode that it thinks you're in. And so that's why that option is more appealing, especially at that moment in time in particular, because the apple is going to take time to chew. There's water in it, so it's not going to be as high in sugar. And there's fiber, so that prevents all the sugar from absorbing into the bloodstream anyway. And there's a lot of fiber to chew, which takes more time. And when we're in that fight or flight mode, we don't want to take time for that. So when we instead get into that 4 to 6 zone and start deciding if we want to eat, that's going to be the best time to make a food decision, and we're probably going to choose healthier options for our bodies. So if you can start to identify throughout the day, where am I on this scale? Am I closer to a 1, closer to a 3, closer to an 8, closer to a 10? It's really important. And setting a routine for yourself, eating every few hours, can help to prevent getting to one extreme or the other. So I encourage you, even on days like holidays, really try not to skip meals, because skipping a meal might end you up in zone 1, which is going to get you all the way to number 10, feeling overly stuffed. So try to remember this at all times of the year, but especially around the holidays. Try to keep this scale from 1 to 10 in mind. And remember, hunger fullness scale is going to help you to recognize your cues so that you can feel better during the day, have more energy, and not feel a crash.